Widow was whipped for begging bread for her child. Mountain man did something that shocked town. The widow begged for bread to feed her dying child, and the town made her pay in blood. The leather cracked against Martha Henley's back like thunder, splitting the mountain sky, and Cedar Ridge held its breath. She had tried to steal a loaf of bread. Nothing more, nothing less. Just flour and water and yeast, baked golden in the morning light, sitting behind glass while her 6-year-old daughter Lucy grew thinner with each passing day. The child's ribs had begun to show through a threadbare dress, and her eyes had taken on that hollow look that mothers fear more than their own death. "Please," Martha had whispered to baker Tom Morrison, her voice barely audible above the bell that chimed as she pushed open his shop door. "Just a small loaf. I'll work for it. I'll scrub your floors, wash your windows." Morrison's laugh had been sharp as broken glass. "Work? Woman, look at yourself. You can barely stand straight. What work could you possibly do?" She could have told him about the nights she spent mending torn clothing by candlelight, her fingers bleeding from the needle. She could have mentioned the washing she took in, though few trusted their clean laundry to a woman whose own dress hung in tatters. She could have spoken of the vegetables she pulled from other people's gardens in the dead of night, leaving behind promises written on scraps of paper that she would repay them when times were better. Instead, she had simply reached for the bread. Now the sheriff's whip sang its cruel song across her shoulders, and the dust of Main Street drank her tears. 10 lashes, Mayor Caldwell had decreed. 10 lashes for theft. 10 lashes while her daughter watched from behind the blacksmith's wagon, small hands pressed against her mouth to stifle her sobs. "Let this be a lesson," Sheriff Briggs called out, his voice carrying over the gathered crowd like a preacher's sermon. But there was no salvation in his words, only the cold satisfaction of a man who had never known hunger's sharp teeth. "We don't tolerate thieves in Cedar Ridge. Don't matter if you're a woman. Don't matter if you got children. Stealing is stealing." The whip fell again, and Martha bit down on her lip until she tasted blood. She would not scream, not in front of Lucy, not in front of these people who watched her suffering like it was Sunday entertainment. Some faces in the crowd showed shame, eyes downcast, shuffling their feet in the dust. Others bore the hard satisfaction of those who believed that suffering was always deserved, that poverty was a moral failing rather than a stroke of fate. Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders and whispered to her neighbor. Perhaps if she hadn't spent her husband's life insurance money on, but Martha had never received a penny of life insurance. Her husband James had died in a mine collapse, crushed beneath tons of rock and dreams. The company had claimed negligence, said he'd been drinking on the job. It was a lie that everyone knew, but no one challenged, because challenging meant losing their own jobs, and hungry children don't care about justice. From the shadows beside Morrison's general store, a figure watched with eyes like winter storms. Ezra Blackwood had come down from his mountain cabin to trade pelts for supplies, but now he stood frozen, his weathered hands clenched in a fist that could have crushed stones. He had seen death in a dozen forms during his years in the wilderness. Wolves circling wounded prey, eagles tearing at fresh kills, the slow starvation of winter when game grew scarce. But this was different. This was cruelty with a human face, suffering inflicted by choice rather than necessity. The 9th lash landed, and Martha's knees buckled. The post they had tied her to bore scratches from others who had stood here before. Thieves and drunks and desperate souls, whose only crime had been surviving in a world that offered little mercy to those who fell behind. "Mama!" Lucy's cry pierced the mountain air like a hawk's scream, and Martha found strength in that sound. She straightened her spine, raised her chin, and stared at the crowd with eyes that held no apology. She had tried to feed her child. If that was a crime, then she would wear the scars like badges of honor. The 10th lash fell, and it was finished. Sheriff Briggs untied her hands, and Martha stumbled forward, her torn dress sticking to the blood on her back. The crowd began to disperse, some hurrying away as if fleeing from their own consciences, others lingering to whisper about justice served and lessons learned. But little Lucy ran to her mother on unsteady legs, and Martha gathered her close, feeling the child's frail body shake with sobs. The bread they had fought for lay trampled in the dust, ground under the boots of those who had witnessed her humiliation. In the shadows, Ezra Blackwood stepped forward, his massive frame casting long shadows across the blood-stained earth. He had buried his own wife and child 3 winters past, their graves marked by stones in a meadow where wildflowers now grew. He knew the weight of loss, the desperate mathematics of survival, the way hunger could drive a soul to places they never thought they'd go. The mountain man moved like thunder rolling down from distant peaks, and something in Cedar Ridge was about to change forever. In the gathering darkness, as mother and daughter clung to each other beside the trampled bread, neither could know that mercy sometimes wears the face of a stranger, and that salvation can emerge from the most unexpected places. The mountain man had buried his own child with these same gentle hands. Now he knelt beside another mother's broken dreams. Ezra Blackwood moved through the dispersing crowd like a shadow given flesh, his boots making no sound on the dust-packed earth. The townspeople parted before him without thinking, some primitive instinct recognizing a predator even when it walked with careful restraint. His eyes never left the woman and child huddled beside the trampled bread. Martha Henley tried to stand, her torn dress clinging to the blood on her back, but her legs betrayed her. She sank back to her knees, gathering Lucy closer, whispering words that sounded like prayers or apologies. The little girl's sobs had quieted to hiccups, but her thin body still trembled like a bird fallen from its nest. "Mom!" Ezra's voice rumbled low as distant thunder, and Martha's head snapped up. She saw a man built like the mountains themselves, broad shoulders that could carry the weight of fallen trees, hands scarred by 1,000 wilderness encounters, and eyes that held depths she couldn't fathom. But it was the gentleness in those storm-gray eyes that made her breath catch. "Don't need your pity," Martha whispered, though her voice carried no conviction. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, but it was all she had left. Ezra crouched down, bringing himself to her level. This close, she could see the lines carved by wind and grief around his eyes, the way his massive frame seemed to curve protectively around some invisible wound. "Ain't pity," he said quietly. "It's something else entirely." He reached in his coat and pulled out a cloth bundle, unwrapping it to reveal dried meat, hardtack, and a small pouch of cornmeal. Lucy's eyes fixed on the food with desperate hunger, but Martha's hand tightened on her daughter's arm. "We can't pay. Didn't ask you to." Ezra set the bundle on the ground between them. "Food's meant to be eaten, not hoarded." Martha stared at the provisions, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. "Why?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the mountains that rose beyond the town's edge. Up there, in a meadow where wildflowers grew, 2 small graves marked with river stones held all that remained of his world. Sarah and little Thomas, taken by fever 3 winters past while he was away hunting. He'd returned to find them cold in their bed, and the silence that followed had nearly driven him mad. "Had a family once," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wife named Sarah, boy named Thomas, about her age." He nodded toward Lucy. "Lost them to the fever while I was up the mountain checking traps. Came home to—" He stopped, the words too heavy to carry. Martha's breath caught. She understood loss. It was written in every line of exhaustion on her face, every careful movement that spoke of a woman carrying too much weight. "I'm sorry." "Me too." Ezra's eyes returned to hers. "But sorry don't feed the living." He stood slowly, his knees creaking like old wood. From another pocket, he produced a small jar of salve that smelled of pine and herbs. "For your back. Sarah used to make it from tree sap and wild mint. Helps with the healing." Martha reached out with trembling fingers to accept the jar. Their hands brushed for just a moment, and she felt calluses thick as leather, but also a warmth that spoke of countless small kindnesses, animals tended, wounds dressed, fires built against the cold. "There's a cabin," Ezra continued, his voice still low enough that only she and Lucy could hear. About a mile up Cedar Creek. Been empty since I moved higher up the mountain. Nothing fancy, but it's got walls and a roof. Door that locks. He paused, studying her face. Might be you, and the girl could use walls for a spell. Martha's pride warred with her desperation. She looked at Lucy, saw the way the child's eyes had brightened at the mention of walls and a door that locked. They'd been living in a lean-to behind the old church, surviving on scraps and the charity of those few souls brave enough to risk the disapproval of their neighbors. Why would you do this for strangers? Martha asked. Ezra was quiet for a moment, his gaze returning to the mountains. Maybe because kindness is like water in the desert. Gets scarce, you start to die of thirst. Maybe because some debts can't be paid to the dead, only passed on to the living. You look back at her. Or maybe because watching that happen to you and your girl reminded me what it felt like to be human. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. In the distance, the church bell chimed the hour, its bronze voice rolling across the valley like an echo of judgment or forgiveness. I don't even know your name, Martha said. Ezra Blackwood. Been living in these mountains nigh on 4 years now. Martha Henley. This is Lucy. The little girl had been silent through their exchange, but now she stepped forward, her small hand reaching toward the bundle of food. Mama, my stomach hurts. The simple honesty of childhood cut through all pretense. Martha's composure finally cracked, and tears she'd been holding back since her husband's death began to fall. Ezra turned away, giving her the dignity of privacy in her grief, and began gathering the trampled bread from the dust. Food's no good now, Martha said through her tears. No, Ezra agreed, but the intention was. He straightened, the ruined loaf cradled in his palm like a broken bird. Sometimes that matters more than the thing itself. As the sun began to sink behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of fire and hope, Ezra helped Martha to her feet. Lucy walked between them, one small hand clutching her mother's skirt, the other wrapped around a piece of jerky that she nibbled with the focused attention of someone who had learned not to waste a single crumb. They walked in silence toward Cedar Creek, 3 souls bound together by loss and the fragile possibility of healing. Behind them, the town of Cedar Ridge settled into evening shadows, unaware that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of its small, closed world. The mountain had come down to walk among them, and mercy wore the face of a stranger. In the gathering dusk, as they walked toward shelter and the promise of safety, none of them could know that their quiet act of human kindness would soon shatter the comfortable cruelty that Cedar Ridge had mistaken for justice. The mountain man walked in a town square and spoke 5 words that made grown men tremble. This ends here and now. Dawn broke over Cedar Ridge like a blade, splitting darkness, and Ezra Blackwood stood in the center of Main Street as if he'd grown from the earth itself during the night. He'd left Martha and Lucy safe in the cabin up Cedar Creek, the little girl finally sleeping peacefully on a rail bed while her mother's wounds began to heal. But sleep had not come for Ezra. He'd sat by their small fire until the embers died, listening to Lucy's steady breathing and remembering another child's laughter that would never echo through his mountains again. By first light, his decision had crystallized like frost on morning grass. The town stirred slowly around him. Baker Morrison emerged first, keys jingling as he approached his shop, then stopped short when he saw the massive figure waiting in the dust. Sheriff Briggs appeared next, hand instinctively moving to his gun when he spotted Ezra, followed by Mayor Caldwell adjusting his vest and gold watch chain with the self-importance of a small man given too much power. "You got business here, Mountain Man," Sheriff Briggs called out, his voice carrying the authority of a badge, but trembling at the edges like a leaf in wind. Ezra turned slowly, his storm-gray eyes taking in each face with the patient attention of a hunter studying his prey. When he spoke, his voice rolled across the square like thunder before the lightning strikes. "This ends here and now." The words hung in the morning air, simple and final as a gravestone inscription. More people emerged from shops and houses, drawn by something they couldn't name but felt in their bones. The electric tension that comes before storms break and worlds change. What ends? Mayor Caldwell stepped forward, his chest puffed with borrowed courage. You got no authority here, stranger. This is a civilized town with laws, and civilized. Ezra's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. You call whipping a starving woman civilized? Beating a mother in front of her child for trying to feed her? She stole. Briggs interrupted, his hand now resting openly on his gun handle. Law's the law. Whose law? Ezra took a step forward, and both men instinctively stepped back. The law that lets bread rot behind glass while children starve? The law that protects property over people? That ain't God's law, and it sure ain't justice. A crowd had gathered now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation like spectators at a hanging. Some faces showed shame. The blacksmith who'd watched Martha's punishment in silence. The preacher's wife who'd whispered gossip instead of offering help. The storekeepers who'd turned away hungry customers with full shelves behind them. But other faces showed hardened defiance. These were the ones who believed that suffering was always deserved, that the poor were poor by choice, that mercy was weakness and kindness a luxury they couldn't afford. You don't know nothing about running a town, Caldwell sputtered, his face reddening. About maintaining order, I know about hunger. Ezra's voice cut through the mayor's bluster like an axe through rotten wood. Watched my boy waste away from fever while I hunted food that never came. Held my wife's hand while she died, apologizing for not being strong enough to fight the sickness. I know what it means to lose everything and have nobody offer a helping hand. The crowd shifted uneasily. Several people looked away, unable to meet his gaze. But I also know what it means to choose kindness when the world's shown you none. To share what little you got when sharing means going without. To stand up when standing up might cost you everything. His eyes swept the gathered faces. That woman you beat yesterday? She's stronger than any of you. Takes more courage to beg for your child than it does to turn away a beggar. Pretty words, Sheriff Briggs sneered, though sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. But words don't change facts. She broke the law. She got punished. That's how things work. Is it? Ezra reached into his coat, and every man in the crowd tensed. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a leather pouch heavy with coins. 3 months' worth of pelts traded in other towns, money he'd been saving for winter supplies. He tossed it at Morrison's feet, where it landed with a metallic thud that seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings. There's payment for your bread. 3 times over, plus damages for your hurt feelings. His voice carried the bite of mountain winter. But that don't settle the real debt. What debt? Caldwell demanded. The debt you owe that woman for making her suffer when you could have helped. The debt you owe her child for teaching her that this world's got no mercy for the weak. The debt you owe yourself for choosing cruelty when you could have chosen grace. The silence stretched like a bowstring. In that quiet, the sound of a child's laughter drifted down from the mountains, probably just the wind through the pines, but made more than one person in the crowd flinch as if ghosts walked among them. You want to settle debts? Briggs had found his courage again, his hand now gripping his gun openly. Maybe you should worry about your own. Interfering with justice, threatening lawful authority. Justice? The word exploded from Ezra's lips like a musket shot. You wouldn't know justice if it bit you on the ass. Justice is making sure children don't starve while their betters feast. Justice is protecting the weak instead of grinding them under your boot heel. Justice is admitting when you're wrong and doing better. He took another step forward, and this time Sheriff Briggs actually drew his weapon, the metal singing as it cleared the holster. Several women in the crowd gasped and stepped back, but Ezra never even glanced at the gun. You planning to shoot me for speaking truth? Going to add murder to your list of civilized acts? I'm planning to restore order, Briggs said, but his voice shook like his hand. Order. Ezra nodded slowly. The kind of order where might makes right and the strong prey on the weak. I've seen that order, Sheriff. Seen it among wolves and buzzards and other scavengers. Never thought to see it wearing a badge. The insult hit home. Briggs's finger tightened on the trigger, and for a heartbeat, the morning balanced on the edge of violence. But then a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Papa, Ezra." Lucy Henley stood at the edge of the crowd, small and thin in her patched dress, but her eyes bright with something that might have been hope. Behind her, Martha approached slowly, her back straight despite the bandages hidden beneath her shawl. The sight of the child broke something in the gathered crowd. Several people stepped forward, tentatively at first, then with growing conviction. The blacksmith moved to stand beside Ezra. The widow Peterson, who ran the boarding house, took a place next to Martha. Old Doc Harrison, who delivered half the babies in town and buried the other half's grandparents, walked through the crowd with his cane clicking on the hard ground. "Enough," the old doctor said, his voice carrying the authority of age and service. "Enough violence. Enough cruelty. Enough pretending we're good people while we watch our neighbors suffer." Sheriff Briggs looked around at the shifting crowd, saw his support evaporating like morning mist, and slowly lowered his weapon. Mayor Caldwell opened his mouth as if to protest, then seemed to think better of it. Ezra knelt down as Lucy ran to him, gathering the child in arms that could have crushed stones but held her gentle as a bird's nest. Over her head, his eyes met Martha's, and something passed between them. Understanding, gratitude, and the recognition that sometimes salvation comes not from above, but from those who've walked through their own darkness and chosen to carry light for others. "This is how it ends," Ezra said quietly, his words meant for the whole town, but spoken to the child in his arms. Not with whips and guns and fear, but with people choosing to be better than they were yesterday. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the shadows that had held Cedar Ridge for too long. Change came slowly to small towns, but it came nonetheless, carried on the voices of those brave enough to speak and the hands of those willing to help. In the gathering warmth of the new day, as neighbors began to truly see neighbor for the first time, none could deny that something fundamental had shifted in the heart of their small world, and that mercy, once unleashed, had its own fierce and unstoppable power. 3 months later, the mountain man prepared to leave forever, but the town would never let him go. The first snow of winter dusted the peaks above Cedar Ridge when Ezra Blackwood loaded his pack for the final time. 3 months had passed since that morning in the town square, and the world had shifted in ways both small and profound. Martha Henley stood in the doorway of what had once been the old schoolhouse, watching him secure his bedroll with the methodical movements of a man accustomed to solitary travel. The building behind her hummed with quiet activity, women mending clothes brought in by neighbors, children learning their letters by lamplight, men sharing tools and knowledge that had once been hoarded like gold. "You sure about this?" Martha asked, though she already knew his answer. She'd grown to read the language of his silences, the way his eyes turned toward the high country when walls pressed too close around him. "Mountains don't wait," Ezra replied, but his voice carried none of its old certainty. "Winter's coming hard this year. Can feel it in my bones." Lucy emerged from the schoolhouse, clutching a slate covered with carefully formed letters. At 9 years old now, they discovered she was older than anyone had guessed, just small from years of poor feeding. She moved with the confidence of a child who had learned she was worthy of kindness. "Papa Ezra, look." She held up her slate proudly. "I wrote your name." The letters were uneven but clear, Ezra. Below them, in Martha's careful hand, were the words, "Our friend." Ezra studied the slate as if it contained the secrets of the universe, his weathered finger tracing each letter with the reverence of a man who'd never learned to read until Martha taught him by firelight these past months. "That's fine writing, little bird," he said, using the nickname that had evolved from her habit of perching on his knee to hear stories of mountain wildlife. "Real fine. Will you take it with you?" Lucy asked, her voice small with the kind of hope that expects disappointment. Ezra knelt down, bringing himself to her level as he had that first day in the dust. "I'll carry it right here," he said, placing his hand over his heart, "right next to the memory of your mama's biscuits and the sound of your laugh echoing through these hills." The changes in Cedar Ridge hadn't come without struggle. Mayor Caldwell had resigned in shame 2 weeks after the confrontation, unable to face the daily reminder of his failures. Sheriff Briggs had lasted longer, but when he tried to arrest old Tom Morrison for refusing to serve the new pastor's wife, a woman whose sin had been marrying a man whose first wife had died in childbirth, the town had collectively turned their backs on him. He'd left on the morning stage, his badge forgotten on his desk like a discarded snakeskin. The new sheriff was Ben Murphy, the blacksmith who'd stepped forward that morning to stand beside Ezra. His first official act had been to post a sign outside his office. In this town, we help first and judge never. His second had been to organize work crews to repair the homes of those who'd been struggling alone. Baker Morrison still ran his shop, but the window that had once displayed bread like precious jewels now held a simple wooden sign: "Hungry children eat free." No questions asked. The first week, he nearly gone bankrupt. By the second month, neighboring towns were sending customers specifically to buy from that decent baker in Cedar Ridge. Kindness, it turned out, was good for business. The Hendersons want to build a proper school, Martha said, watching Ezra check his rifle one final time. Asked if I'd teach in it permanent like. Give me a real salary and everything. That's good news, Ezra replied, meaning it. Martha had discovered a gift for teaching that went beyond letters and numbers. She taught patience to angry children, hope to defeated parents, and the radical notion that everyone deserved dignity regardless of their circumstances. Doc Harrison says he needs help with his practice too, Martha continued. Says I got gentle hands for tending wounds. Ezra nodded. He'd seen those hands work, cleaning his own cuts from mountain brambles, braiding Lucy's hair by lamplight, writing letters for illiterate neighbors who needed to reach distant family. They were hands that had known hard work and harder sorrow, but they'd learned to heal rather than harm. The morning stage rolled down Main Street with its familiar jingle of harness and rattle of wheels. Ezra shouldered his pack, the weight familiar as his own skin, but something felt different now. For 3 months, he'd slept under a roof more often than under stars. He'd shared meals made by other hands, listened to stories that weren't his own memories, and felt the strange warmth of belonging to something larger than his solitary existence. You could stay, Lucy said suddenly, her small hand slipping into his massive one. Mama says the cabin up Cedar Creek is yours for as long as you want it. Says you're family now. Family. The word hit him like unexpected lightning, illuminating corners of his heart he'd thought permanently dark. He looked at Martha, saw her nod of confirmation, saw the hope she was trying to hide behind practical acceptance of his decision. For a moment, he wavered. The high country called to him with its familiar silences and predictable dangers, but these people had become something he'd never expected to find again: home. Little bird, he said gently, some folks are meant to be mountains, and some folks are meant to be valleys. Mountains stand tall and strong, watching over the valleys, making sure they're safe. But they can't come down and live in the valleys without changing what they are. Lucy's face scrunched in concentration. But mountains have snow, and snow is cold and lonely. Sometimes, Ezra agreed. But mountains also catch the sunrise first. They see the whole world spread out below them. And when storms come, they stand firm so the valleys stay protected. He knelt down one final time, gathering both Lucy and Martha into his arms. I'll be watching over you from up there. And every time you see the morning light touch these peaks, you'll know I'm thinking about my family down in the valley. Martha pressed something into his hand, a small cloth bundle that smelled of pine sap and herbs. For when the winter gets too quiet, she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Open it then. The stage driver called out his final boarding warning. Ezra stood, hefted his pack, and walked toward his seat. But at the stage door, he turned back one final time. Lucy, he called. She looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks. You remember what I taught you about being strong? Strong doesn't mean you never cry, she recited, her voice carrying clearly across the square. Strong means you help others, even when you're hurting yourself. That's right, little bird. That's exactly right. As the stage pulled away, Ezra watched Cedar Ridge shrink behind him until it was just a cluster of buildings in a valley, smoke rising from chimneys into the clear mountain air. But the warmth in his chest remained, kindled by the knowledge that kindness, once planted, grows in ways the planter never imagines. That night, camped under familiar stars with the sounds of his beloved wilderness around him, Ezra opened Martha's bundle. Inside was a photograph, the first ever taken in Cedar Ridge, by a traveling photographer who'd been so moved by the town's transformation that he'd worked for free. It showed the three of them standing in front of the schoolhouse, Martha with her hand on Lucy's shoulder, Lucy grinning gap-toothed at the camera, and Ezra looking uncomfortable but genuinely happy for the first time in years. On the back, in Martha's careful script, Ezra Blackwood, the man who taught a town how to be human. Love your family. He propped the photograph against a fallen log and stared into his campfire, feeling the presence of ghosts both old and new. Sarah and Thomas were still there in his heart, but the grief had gentled into something like gratitude. And beside their memory now stood Martha and Lucy, proof that love didn't have to end with loss, that healing could come in unexpected forms. The wind through the pines sounded almost like voices, children learning their letters, neighbors sharing burdens, a community choosing daily to be better than it was. Down in the valley, lights flickered in windows where families gathered around tables, where stories were told and dreams were shared, where mercy had planted its seed and grown into something beautiful. Ezra Blackwood had returned to his mountains, but he'd never really left that dusty town square where he'd learned that some victories aren't won with guns or fists, but with the simple, radical act of treating others as if their lives matter, as if their pain is real, as if their dignity is worth defending. The mountain stood guard over the valley, and in the darkness, both were content. Years later, travelers would speak of Cedar Ridge as a place where strangers were welcomed, where children never went hungry, and where kindness flowed like water from an endless spring. They never knew the name of the mountain man who'd planted that first seed, but his legacy lived on in every act of compassion, every hand extended in help, every choice to see the humanity in those the world had forgotten.